So I'm going to pull this up. It's about a 20-minute video. We're just going to watch the first 10 of it. I would recommend going to watch the whole thing, but the second 10 minutes of it is not really relevant to what we're looking at today.
Good morning.
Fair forewarning, rant, this guy is a little bit opinionated about this. Take it with a grain of salt.
Good Monday morning. I am MPJ and you are watching Fun Function. So today we're going to do a Q&A episode. I asked people to send me questions on Twitter. My Twitter account is somewhere here. MPJ me. So people sent me some questions and I'm going to answer them. Alright, here's one by Juan Martinez. What do you think about the all in JS trend? CSS and HTML in JavaScript. Okay, we are not going to make a Q&A episode anymore. This is going to be a separations of concerns rant. For the people that might not be familiar with this, there was a few years ago Facebook released React, and what they started doing with React that was very controversial at the time and put a lot of people off from React was that they mixed HTML and JavaScript in the same file. And saying that it's okay to mix HTML and JavaScript in the same file, that was at that time sort of like saying that the earth was round. Back in the time when people believed it was flat, people was, what the hell is this? You're crazy. And I shall say that I was one of those people. I was very skeptical about React when I first saw it. I really hated it because it offended my religion of separating HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into these buckets. That was how you did things. But after listening to their motivations for a while, I started to come around. Let's think a bit about the reason why we started as an industry to separate HTML and CSS and JavaScript into separate files from the first place. In programming, there is this concept that is called divide and conquer. It's also often referred to also as separation of concerns. And it comes from the fact that as a human, because programmers are human, there is a limited amount of cognitive space in your brain. Like some people can only think about one thing at a time, and maybe some people can think about two, and maybe some people can even hold 3 or 4 or 5 things in their head at a time. But there is no human being that can hold 10 or 30 or 40 or 100 things in your mind at the same time. So we need to be able to separate our programs so that we can think about one single part at a time. So it's a well-established technique among programmers. It's one of the first things that you learn when it comes to structuring your software, that when you're faced with a big problem, a big hairy problem, it's like eating an elephant. You start by chipping away at it one bit at a time. You basically find a way to break that big problem into many tiny problems, and you create a structure so that you can think about one of those problems like separately. Like divide and conquer is also often talked about as separation of concerns. We have this big problem, this big concern, which we separate into lots of little concerns that are not as scary, so that we can think about these separated concerns individually. Now, the tricky part is how do you separate these things? According to what criteria? What is the individual concerns? So most programmers know about separation of concerns and desire it and want to do it in their software, but you might not necessarily be able to do it. For instance, you might be a junior developer and separation of concerns might be a new element to you. You know that you're supposed to do it, but you're not experienced in doing it, so you can't see how to break this big problem into multiple small ones, because you don't exactly see the seams, so to speak. But it also might be that you're an experienced programmer and you have done this many times before, but perhaps you're tired, or perhaps like you just haven't thought about this problem enough yet, so that you cannot see the trees in the forest yet. And when you're in the situation where you want to separate concerns, but you are unable to see how to do it, it's very easy to fall into the trap of doing something that only feels like you're separating concerns. And in the case of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript debate, that is contained here in the view parts of your application. The view is separated from your business logic, which might be stuff like, if it's an e-commerce system, it would be like the ordering system that goes down in the database and puts orders as paid, sends emails, or tells the payment system that we should process this payment that on the credit card that we got from the view layer. And inside the business logic, there might be even smaller systems, like for instance, like a payment system here that might be able to be contained, so that does not know about all the stuff in the business logic. So that it can process just payments. That way we can think about just payments when we are working in that module. We don't need to keep this entire business layer in our heads. But the problem a lot of people had then in the view was that, how do you organize the view then? How do you break those parts apart? Well, where are the seams in the view that is equivalent to things like the payment system inside your business logic? As an industry, we were confused about this for a long time. We didn't really know how to break the view apart so that we could think about smaller parts of it individually. And this frustrated us because it was too much to think about. So we just started separating it in some way. It was like we were in this mechanics workshop, and there were parts all over the place, and we didn't know how they worked or how they interacted, and we needed to organize them somehow. And in our frustration, we started to organizing them by color, by how they looked, and we put the red ones in the red bucket, and the green ones in the green bucket, and the blue ones in the blue bucket. And it didn't really make anything easier to find, because it was a nonsensical ordering. It was just by how things looked, but it felt better. It felt like we had organized things and we had created order. But in reality, we just had to jump around a lot more between the differently colored buckets and searching around in them. And that's what we did with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. We put them in separate files, and we decreed that this is the best way to organize things. Now things are ordered. But in reality, we learned over time that this is not a sensible way of organizing things. Now, we need to remember that the main reason that we are doing code organization in the first place is so that we can do separation of concerns, so that we can reduce the load on our brains by allowing us to think about smaller subsets of our problem domain, like smaller problems of our big problems, so that problems are contained in small units and not intermingled with each other too much, so that we can think about this. And from that perspective, dividing things into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is like completely nonsensical. Let me show you. CSS and JS. JS. So this is our view, right? HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now let's say that we have a problem with our view and we need to start thinking about it. Now it might be that in some cases that your problem is contained just in the CSS, right? Might be that the problem is just here, it's some pixel that you need to move. However, in my experience, and I think in most people's experience, problems or they span these things. These kinds of problems that span HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are much more common problems than this kind of problem. And that's why this organizing by file type or language type does not make sense, because that will make you like have to jump between these things all the time. So let me draw another one. Like another concern might be like this, or another concern might be like this. Now, if you agree with me that these are our concerns, and this spanning concern is more common than the concern that just concerns one type of technology, then you need, if you agree with that, you also need to agree with me on the fact that this organization, this kind of separation, this is not separation by concern. This is just separation of you know, like color or something. It's just completely arbitrary. It will not help you to think about these concerns individually. It will actually hinder you, because you will have to jump between these contexts all the time. If someone says to you that separating HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that is separation of concerns, then they are bullshitting you. They don't know what separation of concerns means. I think that the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript separation religion that I was once a part of, remember, is another brand of another thing that is pretty widespread and that I think is very, very harmful advice. Well, very harmful, but it's very dumb and unproductive. And that is, hang on, long functions are bad.
So I'm going to stop it there, because it is a very interesting discussion about why whether long functions are bad, whether they're good. Definitely worth a watch, but it's not related to what we're talking about. But does that give you a better idea of how to start thinking about separation concerns? The biggest thing to know as you're working through this, the IDE, the language, the framework, it won't force you to follow good separation concern practices. It won't force you into that. It will let you put the logic, whatever logic you want, you can put in the model, you can put it in the controller, you can put it in the view. It will let you put it anywhere you want. That doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? So in order for MVC to work, you really do have to have a healthy dose of thought and self-constraint about putting it in the right place. So that's one part that you have to kind of know and work through yourself, and as you're building the software, think about what goes where, right? Because it can be very tempting to say, I'm just going to build a massive controller that does everything and put everything in that one controller. MVC will let you do that. You can write nearly any application and put everything into one controller. It will let you do that. But that will make a program that's very hard to maintain. So don't do that. Split it up. Question is, how do we split it up? So MVC has actually been around for a long time. We're talking the first incarnation MVC came about in, if I remember right, the 70s. And if you think about it, well, 70s, that's well before the internet, right? And it's actually before we really had graphical user interfaces, right? So back when MVC was originally invented, it was invented by the research labs at Xerox. for printers, right? Printer drivers and printer software. Back when we only had console terminal modelers that could only spit out ASCII characters to our screens, right? So it is a very old sort of way of splitting up the code, okay? Which means it's seen some changes over time, okay? So the original way that Xerox had diagrammed it, you've got the model. Model is where you store the data. You've got the view. The view is what the UI that the user sees. The controller is this arbitrary thing that does all the business logic. It's not got any sort of physical reality. It's just where we put everything else, kind of thing. And basically the way that the interactions happen, you've got the user on the front here. Well, the user sees, all that they see is what the view shows them. They see what the view shows them. When they click a button, type something into their keyboard or whatever they do, that's going to go to the controller. So the controller is going to take that input and go manipulate the model. So the model updates, that means the view updates, and therefore the user sees the changes to the view. So this is the old way. That was originally that MVC model, right? And you can kind of see, well, business logic probably belongs here, presentation logic belongs here, data access logic belongs there, okay? But here's how it looks like in Microsoft version of this, and how most MVC architectures work nowadays. So you've got the view, it's still the presentation layer, okay? You've got the model, which is that data access, and the brains of the operation. You can see all the fancy UI, and then you got the controller on the back end, which is this thing here. So what actually happens, we say, okay, well, the view, they go visit your website. Well, they're going to get a view initially, right? And then from that view, they're going to go tell, hey, go do something. So that instruction to go do something is going to go to the controller, and the controller is going to give a model back to the view to display to the user. It's going to go do something and give you back a model, which is going to be shown through some sort of view. So the way this lays out, and we have kind of talked about that, basically the presentation logic is going to go into our views, the business logic is going to go on our controllers, and our data access is going to be in our models. Does that make sense? And the way we actually separate this out, when we go to make a project in Visual Studio, you'll see a folder called Views, you'll see a folder called Controllers, and you'll see a folder called Models. So all of our files that deal with views will be in the Views folder, all our files for controllers will be in the Controllers file, all of our files for models will be in the Models file folder. So they'll be split up that way. Just like you're familiar with putting your JavaScript files in your JavaScript folder, putting your HTML in your HTML folder, or the root, whatever it be, and your CSS in the CSS folder. Similar kind of setup. So we'll see that. So that's kind of the preface of the design. Right, this is the kind of design principles that we're going to use as we move into MVC. Are there any questions about separation of concerns at this point? You feel like you have a good grasp of it? Ish. You're obviously still growing because there's a lot of questions out there that are very subjective when it comes to actually dividing up code. It's like, should this go here or should this go here? There's not always a correct answer. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Formatting as a general rule, put it in the presentation, always. But so let's go look at, I'm going to pull down the book. So remember, this is on the home page for there. Those other files. Okay, So we want to get through chapter 1. That's the big goal today. And then we'll hit chapter 2 tomorrow. We'll hit chapter 3 on Wednesday. If this goes over, then we'll be continuing with chapter 1 tomorrow. So, a little bit of history on ASP.NET. So .NET, you're actually already started using. Second semester, you already started writing stuff in C#, right? Well, C# is part of that .NET framework, right? That framework consists of two primary languages, which is C# and VB.NET, Visual Basic.NET. Pretty much everybody's going to write it in C# if they're smart. So that's the underlying, everything in .NET is available there to be used in websites. Okay? What does that mean? Well, link is part of .NET, so link is available there. For loops, if else, variables, all of those things, classes, structs, enumerations, all of those are available in that .NET framework. So all of those classes we have. Okay. Then on top of that is something called ASP.NET. It's built on top of the .NET framework. So ASP.NET is a way to build websites. Okay, provides us tools to write programs that run on web servers. Okay, and specifically ASP.NET runs on IIS, Internet and Information Systems, which is a part of Windows, basically. So any Windows machine can run an ASP.NET application, but I can't run ASP.NET applications on Mac or Linux because they don't have IIS. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the limitation. They can only run on IIS, which IIS is only part of Windows. The old way of doing this, the original way that we introduced to writing .NET websites, was something called ASP.NET Web Forms. Okay? Now, Web Forms is very similar to Windows Forms, which is what you did in the second semester. You wrote desktop applications using Windows Forms, right? What was the main thing that main way of interacting with the user through Windows Forms?
Event handling.
Event handling, right? You responded to event, you did some stuff, and then the user saw the results, right? And there's no network travel. You don't have to send something over the internet between your computer and their computer. It's all on one computer. So managing where the data is stored and the state of the application is easy. It's only one place, right? It's only one place in memory. What Microsoft decided to try and do with Web Forms was make web development very close to desktop development. So that whether you're writing a desktop application or whether you're writing a Windows app or a website, they would be very close. So developers could more easily go back and forth between the two, right? Which meant the primary way to do things in Web Forms was through events. You'd respond to event, do your stuff, show the new stuff to the user. And it kind of made it look like there wasn't a network connection between you two. And in fact, you had very little control over that network connection that happened between the server and the client. Well, what does that mean? Because there actually is one. Well, that means that they were oftentimes slow, and weird things would happen in that transfer, which you had no control over, right? So for instance, the page would refresh on nearly every event. User did something, the page would refresh, and then hopefully Windows Forms did everything great. But it meant that a lot of things in CSS and our JavaScript broke because we didn't have control over the HTML and we didn't have control over how things were going back and forth between the server. Does that make sense? And it meant things were slow because oftentimes we'd have to send these giant objects back and forth to manage what is on the user's screen every time you did a little thing. So they were very slow, very clunky. Oftentimes the code was very hard to read because what ended up happening, remember how we wrote those desktop applications? We had the designer, which is actually on Windows Forms, on web forms they have a designer, and then you have your code behind file. Well, if you're not writing more classes, where are you going to put all your code? You're going to put all your code in that code behind. So now you have a page and this giant code behind that's handling everything on that page and is tightly linked to everything on the front end. So if you make a little change to how it looks on the front end, now you have to go back and change your code behind. And there's very little separation between the front end and the back end. Okay, so that was the world of web forms, right? Well, what do we have now? We have MVC, okay? Web forms is still an option there. When we go to create a project, you'll actually see it as an option that you can click on, but we really don't want to use it. We really would much rather use MVC because it has a lot of benefits, right? So what are some of those reasons? But the place so let me, before I go too far, we place that slots in. We slot it in up here at the same level that web forms is. So MVC lives on top of ASP.NET and .NET. So MVC benefits from all of the development that's gone into ASP.NET and all the development that's gone into .NET. All those features that was built for those, we still have. So great. So we're up here and we're working on MVC, but we don't have web forms. Okay. So we can look at what did we look at that? Well, web view state, wait. So a lot of data we had to transfer back and forth for managing what's on screen. In fact, oftentimes what would go back and forth with view state would even be things like what color is the control or what font is it using, which we really don't want to be sending back and forth every time the user does something or they enter a value into a text field, right? I don't want to send back all that information. The page lifecycle, we couldn't really control how often it would post. We kind of talked about this, false sense of separation concerns. It looked like there were separation concerns, but there really wasn't. It really wasn't working very well. We had very little control over how the HTML actually came out. In fact, we couldn't even reliably necessarily control the IDs of the controls when it got to the front end. Where it might be, hey, I did something, post back to the server, might be something else, or if I change the code, well, because I put this control second, now the third control is a different ID. Because oftentimes it was just based on the order. The ID that was assigned to it had something to do with the order of it on the page. Overall, it was the idea of abstracting it and hiding the fact and making it look like desktop application didn't work often. So it's leaky in that sense, and the abstraction didn't hold up. Oftentimes you had to look under the engine and figure out what was going on and fix it. And then it just was not very testable. So testable in the sense of being able to write automated tests, write code to test code. Write code that would automatically test it every time the developer made change. Well, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that at all with web forms, but we can do that now with MVC. So, one of the big things that's changed, things have gotten a lot more standard. When ASP.NET originally came out, the browsers we had out there were IE and Netscape, right? Things have changed, and those two browsers were very, very different about how they handled JavaScript and such. So it was very hard to write JavaScript that would run on all the browsers out there and run the same way. So we preferred writing the code on the back end instead of using JavaScript because JavaScript was such a pain. Now JavaScript isn't, so that's changed. So we much prefer writing JavaScript now than we write back end. Something called REST has come out. We'll talk more about that as we move into Ajax and writing RESTful APIs or RESTful services. It's a very useful sort of architecture. MVC makes it really, really easy for us to write RESTful APIs, whereas it was literally impossible to do it with web forms. So, and that's a critical part of writing applications today, is to writing RESTful APIs. So that's one of the things we'll want to look at in a few weeks. Okay, agile practices and test-driven development. So agile practices means, what's the easiest way to condense that? Writing software fast, right? And we need to write software a lot quicker than we did 20 years ago. And there's an expectation of getting things out to users a lot quicker than it was.
So my internship at Centene, our team does agile, all like does agile development, and in my supervisor plan, like in the waterfall technique, which is like the old way, it would be like 6 months of development then release, but we do.
No, not 6 months.
Or what, maybe
5 years.
5 years.
So yes. 20 years ago, development cycles were measured typically in years. So a typical development cycle for making a new software application was 3 to 10 years.
We do every week.
Yes,
We
exactly.
do every week.
Yeah, so
That's
when we
smart.
talk about Agile, we talk about doing sprints every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Usually 2 weeks.
Yeah.
sometimes every week, but usually every 2 weeks is the kind of the sweet spot.
Yeah, most other people on IT are usually about 2 weeks, but we're different.
Yeah.
We do 1 week development, 1 week deploy.
Okay, so you're still really 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So that 2 week cycle time, and when we measure getting stuff out to clients, we're measuring it in months now, right? We want to be from the idea coming from the business, like we want this new thing, we want it to be out there in a few months to actual customers. That's our ideal goal. In fact, if we can get it out in weeks, great. That can be actually pretty hard, but at least. So that cycle's
something out there, even though it's not the finished product,
Yeah.
you got something they can use as opposed to
So
waiting the whole
development
time to get anything.
So how we write software has changed, and test-driven development is a thing that's taken off, where test-driven development means that we write the tests. We write the code to test the software before we've even written the code. Before we've written the application, we figured out how to test it. Well, what's the benefit of that? Of figuring out how to test it before we've even written it?
I'll tell you about it, right?
Huh?
I mean, it basically gives you an outline of how you're going to be writing your code, and it lets you jump ahead. Kind of avoid some of the mistakes that you potentially make before you
Okay,
make them.
sort of.
Kind of prevents you from doing what not to do, I guess.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing is it helps.
Say that, but
The biggest thing that it helps us do is it defines the requirements for the software sooner. So, like, what happens if I type in -1 into the application? Oftentimes, the initial version of the rules that you get from your business might not say. They might just say, well, if I'm putting a bid on something on eBay, well, obviously I'm going to put it positive.
yeah, they're not going to pay you to bid. For real.
Right. So some of those things come up, and we got to think, well, what happens if the user puts in a value that we didn't expect? Right? What happens if they put in $1 million when that doesn't make any sense, or they put in -10 when we expected it always to be positive, 0, all these edge cases, and let's deal with those. So it helps us define and think about what should be the outcome of our software. How should our software behave before we're tied directly with how we've implemented it? Because if you start by implementing it, then you as a developer become intricately tied to how you've implemented it. And you only can see things generally how you've implemented it. It's like, well, it behaves this way because I wrote it that way. Right? That's not how we want to write software. We don't want to say to our users, well, it behaves this way because I wrote the code this way. You want to say, okay, how do you want it to behave? And I'll make the code behave how you want it to behave. That makes sense? So we find out from the users, how should it work in these different cases, and then we build the code to match, to meet that requirement. So that's where test-driven development kind of turns everything on its head. And that's really why it's there, because it's about the customer. It's about the client and getting the business what they want, right? Rather than saying, oh, well, I wrote it with this for loop and these ifs and blah, 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 therefore this is the outcome. Because if you do that, well, then you write your tests and say, in a way that you're only testing what you've thought of.
Yeah.
So that's the benefit of that. And MVC really, really makes it easy for us to do that. That's one of the biggest reasons why MVC on the back end has taken off. Is for that reason, is it's very testable. Now remember, as I said, this MVC pattern is actually very old, right? It goes back to the 70s. For a while, it actually somewhat went a little bit dormant. Originally, when we started writing websites, we weren't writing them in an MVC platform, right? We weren't writing them that way. 2004, something called Ruby on Rails came out. And they decided to apply MVC to web development. And people looked at that and said, oh, this is great. Let's borrow that. And Microsoft went through and said, okay, fine, that's what people want. We'll build a brand new version of ASP.NET that uses the MVC design pattern. Node.js is another thing that's out there that's come into play. I won't really go too much about that. Node.js is a really good option out there, and in some ways is kind of taking over ASP.NET market share for a lot of reasons, but I don't want to go too much into why that is right now. Not really for this course. So, key benefits of ASP.NET. It's MVC architecture. Kind of talked about why we want to do that split, why we want to break up our presentation logic, data access layers, why we're going to break that up. Extensibility. MVC lets us add on to it, actually fairly easy. There's a lot of things we can switch out and say, oh, I don't like how MVC works, how Microsoft did this. I'm going to make it work this way. Pretty much everything in MVC can be changed. There's very little, whereas web forms, everything was so locked down, you couldn't change how a lot of things work. I can make my MVC app work any way I want, right? I'm still generally going to have model views and controllers, but I can change a lot of the intricacies of how that works, and it doesn't necessarily have to work the same way that it does out of the box. It doesn't get in my way in that sense. It doesn't prevent me from doing what I need to do. It gives me very tight control over the HTML that I write, the CSS that I write, the JavaScript. I can write anything that's valid JavaScript, anything that's valid HTML, CSS, even if it's invalid, it still let me do it. So it doesn't prevent me from like, hey, there's this new feature that just came out. And now is supported by browsers. This new autocomplete type, and hey, but that didn't exist when the last version of ASP.NET came out, so I can't use it. That same thing exists in SharePoint still, because they're still based on ASP.NET. Still based on web forms. It's like, well, I can't do this because it wasn't there when the last version of SharePoint shipped. It wasn't in the HTML standard then. But for MVC, it doesn't matter, because I can write the HTML any way I want. So if the standard for any of those technologies changes, I can adapt. I don't have to wait for Microsoft to ship a new version. It also gives me a tight control over the HTTP, which is the protocol, the data that we send back and forth between the server. It goes over a protocol called HTTP or HTTPS. There's a lot of things in there that we want to have intricate control over, about how things are sent back and forth and when they're sent back and forth, and MVC lets us do that, which is great. It's is really, really helpful.
What's the difference between HTTP and HTTPS?
One is encrypted, one is not. That's the difference. So HTTP is sent over plain text. Anybody who can see your bytes, anybody who can, let's say you're going through that Ethernet cable right there, right? I can look at all the data that's going over HTTP. If I just plug in something through that between the hub and the wall, and I can read every bit of HTTP, every website that your computer's looking at. I can see everything.
You can do that over Wi-Fi with the packet sniffer, right?
Huh?
You can go do that over Wi-Fi with just a packet sniffer, right? Go
Yeah.
to Starbucks and just read,
Yep.
read everyone's stuff.
Yep.
That's- yeah.
As long as it's going over HTTP, yes, Packet Sniffer will get that too. If you're running over HTTPS, that data is encrypted. So unless you have the encryption key, unless you know this magic number that it was encrypted to decrypt it, then you can't look at it. That makes sense? So it's a security thing. It's a security thing. That is the only difference between HTTPS or HTTP. Is what we call HTTPS is HTTP over SSL. So we just take HTTP, we wrap a little SSL thing around it, and it just goes back and forth inside of SSL. Testability, we talked about that. Routing system is very helpful, especially with SEO. So let's say I was writing in the old web forms, my URL might look something like this. At version 2, user, page ASPX, action to show, prop, blah, 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 ID something. If I hand that to an end user, what's the likelihood that they can read that?
Pretty low.
What's the likelihood that your search engine is going to be able to figure out what that is? Because remember, the search engines are looking at the URLs all the time. That's how they get your search results, is they have to be able to look at that URL and look at that page and figure out what's the content on this page, right? So versus looking at this, to rent Chicago 203 Silver Street. Okay, well, I can tell right just by looking at that, you're looking for, is there property to rent in Chicago at this address? Your search engine is going to be a lot better. It's going to be a lot easier for users to share that, or however they need to share it. And it's going to be a lot easier as well if your backend changes to keep the same URL. Because the problem with this one is if anything on about your website changes, now all the links are dead. All those links that are out there on the internet, whether it be on Twitter or Facebook, doing this, they're all dead. They no longer work. Is that a problem?
Yeah. I mean, you could probably fix it by having it so that when you try to go to that, it redirects it to the new page, but that seems kind of like a hassle.
You might be able to, but you won't necessarily always, because sometimes you need to get rid of that page.
Yeah.
Sometimes you inherently need to get rid of that page in order to make the new thing work.
And you can't
So I've seen them like redirect to like a 404 page or something.
Right.
If
It's not really useful though.
Right, but that's precisely the point. Because now Google has that link in the search engine. It says I get a 404. Guess what it's going to do?
Not show the page anymore.
It's going to pull that out of the search results, and you'll never get that page again. Google will stop indexing. They'll say, "Oh, that page is gone." Okay. Remove it. So all those links, all that hype that you got for people to go to visit your website, yeah, you just lost it. So being able to route things to a specific, more friendly route like this, that's a huge boon. And NBC does make it very simple. Because for the most part, if I want to make this look like that, there's only one file I have to touch. If you do it right, in NBC, there's only one file to make that you have to work with to make URLs look like that. So we're also built on the ASP.NET using modern API. So things like, hey, I want to use all these link features and whatnot. Well, we can use that. Use the await keywords. Yay, we can use that. They say MVC is open source. Kind of is, kind of isn't. It's Microsoft. So yes and no. In some sense, okay, so theoretically the source code's out there. Books get old. Let's be fair about that. Has anybody tried to go out to Codeplex recently? No. Do you know that Microsoft has shut down Codeplex? So, archive. Yeah, so it's, if you go to that link right now, you can still get to it, but Microsoft decided to archive that website, and it's basically no longer active, and it might easily go away in a few years.
So is it open? Is it like no longer open source really, but it kind of used to be?
Well, the ASP.NET platform, MVC, that part is open source, but IIS isn't, which that's kind of the important part, right?
Yeah. Like it needs to be on GitHub or something.
So, okay, all this code is free, but it's running on IIS, which is closed source. So, does it really matter?
It's like giving you a car without keys, kind of.
Well, it's like giving you the fuselage, all the plans for the outside of the car, without giving you the blueprints for the engine. You actually need to go buy the engine from them.
I heard Microsoft bought GitHub or something like that.
They did. They wanted to get up. That was last year.
Do you think they're gonna put all that stuff onto GitHub?
There's a good chance, yeah, that they would take all the stuff that was in Codeplex and move it over. There also is a newer so we're using ASP.NET MVC 5. There is a newer version of MVC called Core, which is on the way replacing the older version of MVC. That one. One of the big reasons, there's two reasons why we're still teaching this version rather than teaching more. One is because it's well established and a lot of companies around town are using this version of MVC. Not everybody switched over to Core yet, but it's also just a matter of training, right? You've got to get the instructors up to date if you're going to teach Core as well. So, those kind of things. So, different constraints. So, Core out there is open source as well. If I understand it correctly, Core does run on Linux now. And you can use VS Code to work with it. So it's a major change, it's a major departure from the old, from MVC. But MVC 4 is kind of the new thing. So it is kind of, they say it's open source. It's not really, because you don't have IIS, right? That's where things stop, is unfortunately you can only go so far. It is helpful in the sense the code being out there, because it does mean if something isn't working, you can look at their code. You can at least dig into it and see, oh, okay, that's how they wrote that part of MVC. And maybe hijack it and change it and revamp it to work the way you need it to. But it's not open source in the sense that you could kind of take it and build your own MVC system. There's not enough of it there. We do kind of, as far as what you need to know in this course, obviously we're expecting that you know some C#. We're expecting that you know some JavaScript. Definitely take your time to refresh on these 2 weeks to make sure you're very up to speed on those two, because we're going to hit the ground running pretty fast with all of that.
So will we be using like jQuery and stuff?
Yes, jQuery will be a part. In fact, the way we're going to do Ajax is going to be through jQuery. So we'll be using jQuery to send those requests to the server. Any other questions there? We'll also be using Bootstrap 4. Which version of Bootstrap did you guys go through when you went through? You went through 4? Okay. Because I know we were just in the process of changing over from 3 to 4. So, fair forewarning, the main template for, the main template for Bootstrap 4 is going to be 3. 3 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is the one that we're going to use. 4 is MVC still ships with Bootstrap 3. So in order to, if we don't go through the empty template, which is what we'll do most of the semester, we'll actually have to go through and take the code that it generates and move it from 3 to 4 by hand. Just a fair forewarning, because Microsoft hasn't updated to 4.
But
There's
Rankin has.
Huh?
But Rankin has.
But we have, yeah. Yeah, last
We're
time
Microsoft.
when I ran this last year, we already ran on Bootstrap 4. So, all right. So there's two kind of they say this book breaks into 2 parts. I would actually break it into 3. The first part of this book being chapters 1 to 6, which is just some introductory sort of material. We'll cover those in the first 2 weeks. The second part is chapters 6 through 12, which is their sports store application. And then from there, everything after chapter 12 is kind of pick and choose. It's reference material that goes more in depth about the concepts that are introduced in the first 12 chapters. So does that make sense? So once we get done with chapter 12, we'll kind of go pick and choose and dive in on the things that we need to. But that's what we're kind of work through. That makes sense? So the first 2 weeks we'll go over 6 chapters, and then the next 6 chapters, and then from there we'll expand and cover a variety of topics that need to be looked at. Yeah. So the example code, there is a link here in the book that says to go to APRESS to get the link. If you pull that code down that they provide, it will not run out of the box. Fair forewarning. It won't run in Visual Studio 2019 correctly. So what I have provided is there's a repo. If you go look at your GitHub repo that you pulled down, look under the textbook folder, if you would. What you should see in the textbook folder is a README file. If you open that up in the text editor, there's a link to the updated code. So I made some updates to fix the broken code that's provided. If you pull that repo down, then you'll get a chance to see the code that's in the book, and it should all work.
What do you run the file with?
Visual Studio 2018? Oh, you're looking at the reading. Just open it in the text editor. Notepad and Notepad++.
Is it the startup files, or is it like already the code?
It's the code for all chapters. It's the code that's written in the chapters.
That's just everything you can I think that's one.
Yeah. That's all the code in the book with my updates.
Okay, cool.
So those programs should run for the first 12 chapters. Some of them I think I've updated to Bootstrap 4. I don't know if I've updated all of them to Bootstrap 4. So that way you can kind of see the code that goes along with it. What software do you need? Obviously you need Visual Studio. We'll also be using SQL Server as we go along. So that's chapter 1. Any questions? Just a quick overview as far as that's concerned. Definitely read it more in depth. Your homework for Wednesday is over chapters 1 to 3. So we'll have a lot of written questions, a lot of theory questions about that.
So like in MVC, does everything like live update when you change something in the code?
Unfortunately, not everything. So if you it doesn't live update the same way that you may have been familiar with brackets, right? So with brackets, remember you could change anything and it would just automatically, you didn't even have to refresh the browser. That kind of live update we don't unfortunately have. What we do have, if you change something in the view and refresh, it will update. So I can change something on the HTML, the CSS, or the JavaScript, any of those changes, I can just refresh the page and it'll be fine. If I change anything though on the model or the controller side, I do have to actually rebuild the project, unfortunately. So those changes do become harder to test if you're not using unit testing. Does that make sense? So those parts I have to say, okay, build and, run the program, go try it out, and then go back and forth. So the live update for the C# parts basically isn't there, if that makes sense. So for the views, you'll get live updates, but you won't get live updates for model or controller changes. Okay. So what's due for tomorrow?
1A.
Homework 1A. So that's what you need to finish before class tomorrow. And you've seen all that is just making sure that your software is installed, basically. There's a bunch more details about how to customize Visual Studio. I did put a section on there how to add a start without debugging button to your toolbar, because that's going to be a very helpful thing, for instance, because that makes things run a lot faster to have that quickly available. Even if you have run through previously, like last year, if you went through the Tortoise-Git install instructions, I would recommend doing everything again because there are some things that have changed to Tortoise-Git and Git since last year. So I would run through all of the instructions again.
Do that?
Nope, you don't need to uninstall it, just install on top of it. Okay. So you don't have to uninstall anything. Just install the new versions.
What is Git SCM? SCM, is that like?
So that's the command line tools.
Um,
That's the command line tools. So you want to run through the install directions and there's a few things that have changed. Like one of the things that they added for Git SCM is a way to use Notepad++ when you're looking at things over the console. You used to have to use Bash to look at objects.
So, do we have to actually install over Tortoise-Git, or can we just go to settings and just do this?
Install over it. You'll want to install the new version over it.
Yeah, oh no, actually updated.
Oh, especially with Git SCM, there are some things that are in the install.
Or we need to get or yes, that's all.
So go back up this one.
Yeah.
This screen you'll only get if you go through and install it. So,
Gotcha.
so go through everything, install over, and obviously Visual Studio is updated, so there's going to be some use. There's going to be a definite update to Visual Studio.
Do you want us to download the 2018 version or 2017, 2025?
2018. Yes, you definitely want 2018.
Okay.
Definitely good. 2017 and 2019 are pretty close, but there's enough differences to recognize when I grade it and when you grade it.
Okay.
So you don't want to be in the boat that like, well, it worked on 2017,
Right.
didn't work when I ran it because I'm going to run it on 2019.
Okay.
So definitely 2018.
so I'm trying to install over code and
Just hit repair.
It's recommended one.
You can pull it down.
Finish it.
Is that your username?
Yeah,
I just thought of anything. I just thought of anything. Yeah, that confused me as well.
Okay, so one thing you want to make sure and do, so generally speaking, I'd recommend that the username you want to use is your production username, but it is what it is.
I have that.
So you can verify that
Yeah, do that.
Okay, so use
Yeah. I should just spell that. I wish we just like pictures of it.
Sure there is.
Yeah.
I hate that.
Oh, there it is. If you want to change, that's your separate here. So you can change
Thank you.
this. If you want to change it to your, I would change it to some underscore code.
Good thing I already have that installed.